Good morning and welcome back to the Space Madness podcast. Today we have the first ever part two of a guest story and possibly two of three, but we'll see. When we last spoke with Lou here, we were reaching the end of the 1960s. We were getting some details about some of the biggest missions and how they began. But where we want to go today is into the story of the Planetary Society. Oh, and Wednesday the cat, my co-host, is with us today from the beginning. So Lou, if you could, I'd just like to hear, starting from wherever your mind goes when we talk about the beginnings of the society. I grew up in a world where it already existed, and so I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, well, nice to be here again. I'll take the fact that I'm the first ever part two due to my age, and if you get older people on me, you can justify parts 3 and 4.
Deal.
But let me go to that one. Also,
age and accomplishments.
And let me also make a slight correction to what you said. We had reached the end of the 1970s.
Okay.
In our previous discussion, we were into the Voyager mission, which of course was launched in the late 1970s and was flying. Around that time, the Voyager mission was launched, great public interest. Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, they put pictures on the cover of the encounter with Jupiter, I think, and Viking was a big success in the sense that it, first lander on another planet, had worked, it was still working actually in the late 1970s, it worked all the way to 1981, and it was transmitting pictures of another world, which were fascinating. So there's all this, kind of high public interest in planetary exploration. Bruce Murray had become director of JPL, and there was a change of administration happening in 1980. The Carter administration was somewhat supportive of space science, but had deliberately decided not to do any space initiatives. But when the Reagan administration came in, they announced that they were going to stop planetary exploration. And the OMB issued a directive saying that the planetary division should basically shut down at NASA and wait until the shuttle was built. And NASA was going through a great deal of difficulty getting the shuttle built at that time. Sagan and Murray were sort of becoming colleagues at that point because Carl Sagan was out here in Pasadena as part of the Voyager team, actually. He had been part of the Viking team. He was now one of the Voyager scientists. He was participating with the team. And he was also working with a PBS show called Cosmos, which was being developed here at the PBS station in Los Angeles, KCET. So he was actually in residence out here, and he and Bruce Murray would frequently meet, and they said, here you have this great dichotomy, enormous public interest in these planetary encounters and a political decision to cancel planetary exploration. We've got to do something. And planetary scientists were, of course, very concerned. They saw this whole activity. There was a Venus radar mission being developed. There were Mariner missions there was a deep outer planets were being developed. There was a great effort to do a mission to Comet Halley, which was coming through the solar system in the mid-1980s. And all of these efforts were going to be canceled. And so they were saying, do something. Well, what do you do? Well, in the 90s, what you did is you formed a public interest organization, an organization which was a nonprofit, citizens advocacy. Of course, there were industry associations, but they were basically lobbying for the business contracts of aerospace companies. There were science organizations, but they were basically there to ensure good communications among scientists worldwide. But for actual advocacy, to advocate government action, there was none. And the idea of forming a public interest organization was something that they said thought needed to be done. Well, I happened to be working as a congressional science fellow on leave from JPL at that point. I was working in the U.S. Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee as a staffer on a AIAA, American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics, Congressional Fellowship. And so I was temporarily there for a year. And I'd come back to JPL and report in, what's going on in Washington kind of thing. And I had come to a similar conclusion, noting what was going on in other fields like communication satellites, remote sensing satellites, that associations were being formed of either industry groups or user groups, and they were advocating, Congress loves advocacy because it's like supplicants coming before the king. Everybody comes to Congress and they would advocate their position and for legislation, for funding. But nothing like that was going on in science. And I said, we need to form something like that in science. So one day when I was back in Pasadena on one of these trips back here, I was reporting to Bruce, and he said, wait, I want to talk to you. And he said, Carl Sagan and I have been meeting, and we think we need to do something. You're going to be finishing up your fellowship and coming back here, and there's no missions to work on back here because everything's being stopped. So we think you might want to come in and work with us on this effort. I said, well, that's pretty exciting. He said, and I'll have Carl come and talk to you about it. Well, I knew Sagan not well. I had presented to a couple of meetings on committees that he was on. I had never closely worked with him, but we had some interaction on as I say, he was working on various NASA committees and science studies. I think I presented both some of my work on advanced missions to him in the late 1970s. But I had never really known him very well. And so when I went back to Washington, back to my congressional science fellow job on the staff there, Carl came down to Washington and visited with me and gave me a lot more of his thinking on forming an organization. And I remember saying to my wife, I said, well, these guys really terrific. I admire both of them enormously. Bruce was the director of JPL, and Carl was Carl, and getting enormous public attention, as well as being a great participant in these planetary science missions. He said they're the smartest and the best I've ever worked with. I don't think they really know what they're doing on the public membership organization aspect. And I don't know that I can really give up my life to work on something we don't know how to do. But I'd like to work. But
sure.
The chance to work with those two people on a new venture was just too great an inducement. So I said yes, and when I came back to Pasadena, I immediately began the sort of mechanical ideas of trying to form a new nonprofit organization.
If I could just interject, dedicating your life to do something we don't know how to do sounds a lot like JPL to me.
Right. Well, there is that to it as well. But this, of course, was more of a business aspect. A lot of the forming of a nonprofit organization, your first job is to have a vision and a cause-related statement to promote the exploration of other worlds and the search for other life through public education, through citizen advocacy, through publications. That's a mission statement. But you also have to go through the business of how do I incorporate? How do you write articles of incorporation? What are bylaws anyway?
Yeah.
Things you wouldn't know anything about, Jeff, because you have no background in that area.
Well, it's certainly not covered in engineering classes.
But it was covered in your law classes very well. But I didn't have any background in that area. But fortunately, both Carl and Bruce knew a lot of people and began talking to a lot of people. And I could just mention a few who were very influential. One of the most influential was John Gardner. Do you remember him? Do you know of him?
I don't think I do, no.
Look him up.
Okay.
He was a secretary of, I think it was called Health, Education, and Welfare at that time, in the Lyndon Johnson administration. He was the founder, and he's most noted as the founder of Common Cause, a political reform organization, citizens advocacy, nonprofit, who advocated political citizens get involved in political reform, anti-corruption, pro-democracy activities. Common Cause was a very large public membership organization, one of the most fastest growing and successful of its time. John Gardner, in my opinion, was one of the few people in my life that I'd met that I thought just ipso facto would have made a great president of the United States. And he was briefly mentioned in one of the Republican primary races way back in those years, but never had a lot of political legs in that regard. But Common Cause was enormously successful. So John knew all about forming a public interest organization, and he was immediately able to put us in touch with the people who knew what to do legally, the people who knew what to do fundraising. So we made some very important contacts at that time. Another chief guy was Harry Ashmore. Harry was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist from Little Rock, Arkansas, who had won the Pulitzer Prize by writing on race relations in the Deep South in the 1950s and 1960s. Harry was also one of these people who was into the whole idea of forming citizen advocacy groups. And that was a movement at the time. It was mostly centered in the environmental community. There were a lot of things like the Friends of the Earth and the Sierra Club, organizations that had formed to be pro-environment. The incoming Reagan administration had some very anti-environment guy recommended as Secretary of, Commerce, or maybe it was even, or Secretary of the Interior or something. And there was a lot of political action going on in the environmental movement. And the way you built a public interest organization in the 1980s was, there wasn't an internet. You didn't just go on and have a social media kind of discussion about these things and get everybody with their opinions blogging, and advocating and online. There was no such thing as online. It was called direct mail. And you probably called it junk mail. You get these things in your postal box and your post office mail, and it asks you to send money for various causes. We get them now all the time, but that was the only way in the 1970s and 1980s. And so they put us in touch with direct mail people, experts in direct mail.
Okay.
Some of the direct mail is political advocacy, Democratic Party, Republican Party, various candidates, things like that. Some of it is cause-related, environmental movement, health movements, and so forth. And we became a citizens advocacy group in planetary exploration, planetary science. Now, if you notice what I'm telling you here, is we were started by people whose main interest wasn't space exploration. We were started by people whose main interest was citizens' involvement in worthy causes. And I think that's important because it always has colored my view of the role that the Planetary Society should be taking, which is that of not a space interest group, but a public interest group. And we should advocate not on behalf of the space industry or even on behalf of the space sciences, but on behalf of the citizen interest in space exploration.
Sure.
So those were the big forces. They led to a initial direct mail effort, which was quite successful and enabled us to bootstrap ourselves. We were the fastest growing public membership organization of any kind in the early 1980s.
Wow.
And grew from zero to, I think, about 100,000 in space of a couple of years, for a few years.
Wow. One of my first thoughts throughout this part of the story was just how remarkable it was, at least to me, and perhaps I'm more bureaucratic than I want to be, but was that the director of JPL was able to make these kinds of plans while he was the director of JPL for an advocacy organization that affects JPL.
Well, I have to tell you, it was very cautious. Bruce was rigorous, and we were rigorous in separating out any of that. All discussions were outside of JPL. No JPL resources were used. We were very when I started the organization, started looking for office space, and I went to Caltech, and there were other groups having office space at Caltech, but they wouldn't let us do it because there was too much association. There could be a conflict of interest with the JPL connection. So we were very, very careful to keep separate any JPL activity. Yeah. We were intellectually connected with the people there and efforts there, but we had no financial or facility connection at all. Sure.
I imagine, I'm just thinking of the process of trying to get something like that approved today. Probably you had more open-minded administrators back then?
Well, I don't think, no, because we were there. I don't think so, Jeff. I think
Really?
the hostility toward us at NASA was enormous. We had terrible relations with NASA. They first of all never really trusted Bruce Murray or Carl Sagan because they would advocate science missions, and NASA wasn't interested in science missions. They were interested in building the shuttle, and the relationship with the NASA administrator, James Fletcher, was quite bad.
Interesting.
When we testified to Congress, we never testified against anything NASA was doing. But when we testified about things they should be doing differently, they didn't like it.
Sure.
So there was an attempt. I can tell you there were NASA administrators who called up not just Bruce Murray, but after Bruce left, other directors of JPL, and ordered them to get control of the Planetary Society.
Wow.
To shut Lou Friedman up or to shut so-and-so up. But of course, there was an independence. And the role of an independent, nonprofit organization without those affiliations, without that dependency on NASA money, is crucial.
Wow. So tell me about when you must have known you were being very effective at that point, when you started getting people trying to shut you up. I mean, what was that like?
Well, I just can't admire Carl Sagan and Bruce Murray enough. First of all, it helps. They are giants. They were giants. And so therefore, they're not easy to push into a box. Carl, his whole career, is noted for being somewhat speaking truth to power. He was an advocate of climate change before climate change was even in the lexicon of words. His PhD thesis was about greenhouse gas on Venus and how that contributed to the warming of the planet Venus, and its lessons to earth science occupied much of his career after that. He was an activist in the nuclear disarmament issues. And by the way, that was something that was sort of simultaneous with his advocacy of Planetary Society activities, and we kept that very separate too. So we were able to draw our own lines in. But when people tried to squelch us or them, we didn't just say yes, sir. And Bruce Murray was director of JPL. He was actually fighting NASA because he was trying to get a Comet Halley mission started. The U.S. alone among spacefaring nations was not going to do a mission to Halley's Comet. And we always thought we were going to do a mission to Halley's Comet. We had a lot of work going on about it. Russia had made the decision, the Soviet Union had made the decision to redirect one of their Venus missions to do a swing by of Venus and be the first to encounter Halley's Comet. The European Space Agency made a decision to do their first interplanetary mission as a mission to Comet Halley. Japan was doing a mission to observe Halley's Comet, but the U.S. wasn't. And Bruce was trying to get JPL positioned so that they could do a mission to that, and NASA was resisting it. And so Bruce was at great odds with NASA. And ultimately, I think that led to his somewhat short tenure as director of JPL.
Really?
I'm not saying that it was the cause. I'm just saying that it was a series of high tension. It's hard for you to understand. Maybe now you will understand as we go into this decade, 2024, 2025 period. In the 1980s, we had an administration that was openly hostile to planetary science and tried to suppress everything about it. And you had yet an advocacy group who was taking that on as an issue. And
it is hard to imagine a world where there was a single advocacy organization that was so effective and active, whereas now there's countless ones that are smaller, more distributed in all kinds of fields.
There was a National Space Society that had actually preceded us, in fact, and we had a lot of discussions with them. They were a broader view of themselves. They were for anything in space, basically. So they were a space, and they were very much a space interest group.
Sure.
Despite the fact that they were led by a well-known journalist, a television personality, Hugh Downs. But they were still very much a space interest group, very close ties to the space industry. We actually refused to take any space industry money, and we were not just for anything in space. When we testified about the space station, we basically spoke against the administration proposal, but we entitled our testimony "A Space Station Worth the Cost." And it was a different kind of space station. It was one that would build up human life support capabilities for eventual interplanetary travel to explore the planets, whereas the space station that was being proposed was being done on a lot of obvious nonsense about commercial opportunities with microprocessing in space. That was the way it was being sold.
Interesting. So there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind there. One, I think that most people at JPL, at least below the management level, they don't really realize that the job of the administrator is to fight for missions and to fight for, I think that's becoming very clear now, but I don't think that's communicated downwards very well for obvious reasons. Certainly wasn't when I was there. I kind of had to figure it out by looking upwards and bothering everybody and talking to everybody like I always did. Now, it sounds like Bruce may, I don't want to say taking it too far because that's the job of the administrator, but to hear you say that...
The director of JPL, yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, director of JPL. But to hear that might have created some reverse pressure against his tenure is a really interesting thing.
Also going on at that time was an effort by NASA to cancel the Galileo mission development. And Galileo was being developed, and they kept changing its launch vehicle because the shuttle wasn't ready, and this upper stage wasn't ready, and then it was going to be ready, and then they had to use the shuttle, then they couldn't use the shuttle, back and forth.
Yes.
And NASA was trying to actually cancel the Galileo mission. They had made the decision to cancel the Venus Orbiting Imaging Radar mission, but JPL came back with a revised plan at much lower cost, which ultimately became the Magellan mission, and the Reagan administration wasn't going to allow these things. Finally, with I think some successful advocacy by us, some development was allowed to continue, but no planetary missions were actually launched until 1988.
Jim Erickson was telling me recently about the various delays on Galileo. I didn't realize that it was, depending on how you count it, it was 6 total years of delays, as I understood it, for various technical and programmatic reasons. I mean, I guess all of these things seem in the past, but 6 years, year after year, is maybe it's more common throughout JPL's history than we want to acknowledge.
Well, the 1980s were basically the 1970s were an active decade. Mariners and Viking and Voyager, these were dark. Voyager was going on, it made its encounters, just like the Europa Clipper is going on today. They can't call it back. I'm sure the Trump administration would like to recall the Europa Clipper, and I'm sure the Reagan administration would have liked to have recalled Voyager. Those same forces were going on, but not much else was getting started. And just like today, when the Trump administration has now ordered the cancellation of all planetary programs, the role of advocacy, now I want to say it's important, but it doesn't substitute for government action. You advocate, as we can see in the political forces going on today. They can be a little bit influential. They might be influential on the margins. They can keep a dream alive, but they don't actually conduct the missions or fund the agencies that have to be funded.
Yeah, necessary but not sufficient. Speaking of advocacy, I'm curious about the experiences you referenced about testifying to Congress. And it sounds like you, at least, I don't know how many times that you personally did that, but I'm curious if you could.
Probably 4 or 5, I think.
4 or 5.
At least.
So can you tell me about those experiences? That would seem to be the function of the society condensed into a day. I mean, at least that's how I imagine I would feel waking up in D.C. on those days. Like, all of this is for this meeting, this hearing. I mean, what was that like for you?
Well, let me say that advocacy is broad, very broad. It's not a thing. And so, I'll relay one Carl Sagan story. Carl got to, because of his well-known fame and his popularity, he got to go to the White House for a private meeting. I think it was with Jimmy Carter. I think it was with Jimmy Carter. Yes. And Carter had a young daughter, Amy, I don't know, and Sagan got to, and so we introduced it was a family visit, in the White House, and he got to speak to Amy about, and Carter, of course, was enthralled with the whole thing. Jimmy Carter was one of our smartest presidents of all, and he was a scientist, too. Worked in nuclear engineering. And so at the end of the meeting, Carter says to Sagan, you're terrific. You really make the case well. You need to write more books. This is so important. And Sagan, who was pretty quick on his feet, says, Mr. President, all you have to do is write your name on a single document, and you can make the mission happen. And Carter looked at him and just smiled. And it's a very important message. Carl would relay that story. It's an important message, because while that is literally true, in a sense, I can sign it, it's not really true.
Right.
Presidents have very limited power. George Bush, H.W. Bush, the first, George Bush, and the second George Bush, George W. Bush, both declared humans are going back to the moon and Mars. They signed documents that said it. They gave speeches for it. Nothing happened. They had no power because they had no political backing. They had no rationale. So Carter was right. Carl Sagan had to write more books. He had to develop popular rationale, that public constituency. That's a long way of me getting to your question about getting to that moment of testifying to Congress. That's pretty much theater. It's a show. They have their prepared questions. You have your prepared answers. It's all orchestrated beforehand as to who's going to come and say what. And the end goal is clear on the part of the people organizing the meeting and the Congress, and in saying, you will testify because we want to advance this particular piece of legislation or funding or whatever. So it's very important because you get a great platform.
Yeah.
It is influential. You get good press coverage. Remember one time Carl and I testified together, maybe it was that space station one, and then we had to go to a meeting, a private meeting with one of the congressmen, but in between, press had decided to have we had to have a press conference, so we weren't going to get any lunch. So Carl and I talked somebody into bringing us lunch that we could eat during the press conference and do that. So what I'm getting at is you get a lot of attention.
Sure.
And so it is crucial. And we testified on behalf of the Halley Comet mission effort. We testified on the space station issue. We testified in later years as the Mars program began to get reactivated. It became a geopolitical significant thing. We had come out with a proposal for cooperative U.S.-Soviet human exploration of Mars as a great both peace and space initiative and high technology initiative. And we testified on these things. We testified on SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which Congress was opposed to. And so we had several times testified, once or twice with Carl, and once or twice as part of panels with other space interest groups or other science advocacy organizations.
Yeah, you're getting to another point that I don't think I realized until 8 or 9 years into my effort of understanding NASA, just that even the administrator has very little power beyond implementing the president and congressional priorities.
That's right.
And that was somewhat disheartening.
And that's going on right now. The administrator.
Yeah.
There's no administrator, or there's a half an administrator, whatever. It doesn't matter. OMB is calling the shots. The Office of Management and Budget, under the president's direction, is calling the shots for NASA. And and usually in the past, in the years that I was involved, Congress was active. They would counter the OMB. If OMB issued something, somebody in Congress would get a resolution or get a committee letter out saying, don't do this, do this. Well, now Congress is acquiescing it to everything, and so it's a very different situation. It will be interesting for me to see if there's any pushback on the actions that OMB has just ordered for NASA to cancel planetary missions. There's talk about Congress pushing back, but I don't think they're going to push back in planetary science.
Well, on Friday there was the Senate markup hearing where they approved. They did reject the cuts, and they approved NASA up to $25 billion, but then they couldn't finish the job because they were arguing about
that's what
the
I mean.
FBI.
You say there was a subcommittee did this, but the committee can't do it. Then they adjourn, and then they'll have a continuing resolution. Yeah, I mean, let's see what happens. It'd be interesting to me if any congressional pushback.
I try not to be too naive, but also not too jaded, whether it's a coincidence that there was a 0.1 FTE administrator appointed the day before that hearing. I don't know. I try not to go down too many speculative rabbit holes. But you mentioned something about 5 or 10 minutes ago that I didn't know about. Not that I'm some standard bearer for space history, but I didn't know about the Comet Halley space race,
really?
mini space race.
Wow.
And I find that very interesting. I'm going to have to look it up later. I didn't realize.
It's written up in a few histories. I think John Logsdon wrote about it, and I know Bruce Murray in one of his books wrote about it, and there's of course a lot in the Planetary Report about it, and I wrote about it some in one of my books as well, the effort to do a Comet Halley mission. But ultimately the U.S. didn't. Since you're interviewing me, I'll say when I came back to JPL, I told you that was initially I was half-time at JPL and starting the Planetary Society. That didn't work. I had to quickly leave JPL, and the line was too hard to keep separated. But my initial job was to start something called the International Halley Watch. And that was to be a science coordination activity among spacefaring nations to coordinate observations and involve the ground-based astronomy community in Halley's in sharing the observations. So we started the International Halley.
This is what we would now call citizen science, right?
Well, yes, but it did include space organizations. And I was the head of it initially, and then I left, and somebody from NASA was appointed as the head of it, and then it rotated around, and it involved all the space agencies. And I say, a lot of amateur organizations participated. Well, that went on during the 1980s. And the U.S. did play a role. We played a role in the sense that the JPL navigation measurements with the Deep Space Network were used in a cooperation effort with the Soviet Union and with Europe to help in the navigation of spacecraft to the comet. And so I got to go to all the Halley Comet encounters. There was the Moscow with the Soviet missions, there was Darmstadt, Germany with the European mission, and then a worldwide conference held in Paris to bring the results out. And so Halley's Comet was a dominant theme in the 80s. It was a chance to see a large comet up close. Now, admittedly, at very high flyby speeds, was unique, and it has a lasting legacy. So I'd say it's worth looking into.
Sure. So I'm just thinking of JPL navigation support. That doesn't happen without authorization and charge numbers and headquarters. So it sounds to me that So it sounds like you got NASA's official involvement despite itself, or lacking some other way of putting that.
Admittedly, that was pretty low level kind of funding, and it was a testy time. I went to the Soviet Union for the Halley Comet encounter. There were many American scientists there, but there was no official NASA participation, and there was some NASA effort to try and squelch the cooperation of participation of certain American scientists. John Simpson of the University of Chicago was an experimenter on the Halley Comet mission, and he was not approved by NASA. They tried to keep him out of it, and he worked around the system, and others did as well. It was a time of it was a transition time. It was a time of absolute hostility to somewhat opening up as the Gorbachev years were developing.
Wow. And at that time, you were not a NASA employee at all.
No,
so
I was able to go.
They couldn't stop
in fact,
you.
That's one of the reasons that we did so much and were so active in both the Halley Comet effort and then later with Mars rover testing, is we were filling a niche that NASA wasn't willing to fill.
Well, and you get back to the knowing smile of Jimmy Carter at that remark from Carl, which is that it takes so many different forces and influences and actors to make these big things happen that have never been done before, and that our political systems aren't designed to enable. I mean, the society was so instrumental in a time when the traditional forms of leadership were not interested.
And that came to the fore when the Mars rover advocacy, that was another big part of the Planetary Society, starting in about late 1989.
Okay.
NASA was opposed to planetary rovers. The science community actually was against it because they thought it took up too much weight away from the valuable payload of science instruments. And the initial plans for a Mars Pathfinder mission did not have a rover on it at all. But there was our efforts with testing. The Russians were working on rovers, and we began testing Russian rovers in high visibility events, both in Europe and in America. And we introduced rovers to Dan Golden, who became the new administrator in 1991. And then we arranged for a demonstration of Mars rovers both on the beach in Santa Monica and at the Rose Bowl area in one of the pavilions, and then ultimately at JPL. And so gradually the whole notion of rovers was getting more public attention. Meanwhile, some scientists who did have a lot of forethought, was small thinkers in the science community who were against it, but big thinkers who got the point. We can't just use sampling where we land. For one thing, it's a contaminated area, and for the other is it's not a very interesting area because it had to be a safe area. So to interesting.
And it had to be somewhat known already to try to land on it.
Efforts of scientists and engineers at JPL, Donna Shirley at JPL, Tony Spear, who was the Mars Pathfinder leader, Glenn Cunningham, who was the Mars Observer leader. These were people who had the big picture involved, good support from the laboratory, good support in the science community with people like Steve Squires and Ron Greeley and others, and Jim Head at Brown University, ultimately convinced NASA to put the Sojourner rover as an experiment, and a little rover fit on my desk here. You can see.
Well, I'll say that rover, I distinctly remember I was in high school. I walked out of my home in the morning and saw the newspaper with that photo on the ground on Greenfield Avenue in West LA. And it took me a while longer to find my way to JPL, but that image never left my head, that there is this little toaster-sized rover. And over the years, I would repeatedly reflect on how impactful that was, that such a thing was possible.
Yep.
And then, of course, we've had several more since. And with increasing levels of complexity and almost absurdity, the first time I learned about the airbag solution, I thought, this is out-of-the-box thinking.
Bizarre, right?
Yeah, and of course the Sky Crane twice successful, and who knows what's next. Although my understanding is we need the supersonic decelerator parachutes to land 1,000-kilogram payloads, and that's a long-term development program. But the ingenuity of JPL over the decades, obviously, as you know more than me, just inspired. So you mentioned the geopolitical angle. I mean, I'm curious, as the Planetary Society went into the 90s and the Soviet Union fell, I'd love to hear your thoughts generally on that. Was there a point at which you realized you weren't just advocating for science anymore, you were advocating for constructive global partnerships? I mean, it seems like maybe it felt like it was a continuum, but that's getting, pretty big deal.
In the mid-'80s, there was a lot of attention and tension on the whole issue of nuclear disarmament relationships between the United States and Soviet Union, efforts to deal with this enormous issue of two adversaries with all these nuclear weapons, always in a state of high tension against each other. And the advocacy for really finding things they could work on in a common way was important. And we were a number of people. Remember, I told you we were greatly influenced. In fact, we were started by, and most of our advisors were not space interest people. They were people with broad political and social interests, journalists and writers and thought leaders in many fields. And they began urging us to take on this issue of international cooperation with Soviet Union, Europe, other spacefaring countries, big projects that served as both challenges for the high-tech industry, but also as science and publicly engaging goals for population of great. And that led to our advocacy for human exploration of Mars as a joint Soviet-American, and it made it all the way up consideration as a summit agenda item between Reagan and Gorbachev. He had a full-page ad in the Washington Post, signed by thousands of people, including many leaders of the country, of advocating this goal. And the point is that if you think about the space program generally, it's a very minor point politically. You never hear it mentioned in a political campaign. Rarely do you hear a president or a politician talk about the space program unless he's in some district with the industry involved. But it's huge geopolitically. It was the whole Apollo program wasn't done for lunar science. Kennedy had no interest in lunar science. He was basically against the space program. He was only using it because it was a way to demonstrate in a peaceful way the superiority of capitalist technology over communist technology. And that was it. And if you ever listen to the Kennedy-Webb discussion of the Apollo program, Jim Webb, the then administrator of NASA, would talk about all the great things NASA could do, and Kennedy said, no, you're going to beat the Russians to the moon. That's what your job is, beat the Russians to the moon. That was his only interest. And that was a great initiative, and that led to the Apollo program. And as soon as we beat the Russians to the moon, it ended the Apollo program. Nixon came in, had no interest in it whatsoever. He rejected any follow-on. He was first follow-on was attempted to be a human mission to Mars. He said, no, too expensive. Okay, let's do a space station. No, too expensive. Okay, let's build a rocket that will go to Earth orbit and be reusable. Well, okay, you got to keep NASA doing something. Is that the lowest cost option? Yes. Okay, we'll give it that. And the next year he lowered the budget on it and made it only partially reusable. There was the Space Shuttle was an anti-space decision made by the Nixon administration. Then we go on. What's the next great human initiative? Well, it's going to be the space station, right? It was at Reagan in 1984. It went nowhere for 8 years. Reagan proposed it, but it never got, not a bit of it got built.
Now, what was his motivation for that in 1984?
His motivation was basically, Reagan had a vision, and vision was great technology for America, and advancement, and it was good for the industry, and he coupled it with his bigger initiative called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was Star Wars, which was the idea of protecting the U.S. with a global defense system. But neither of those got built. And the rationale for the space station was always suffering, and it only got built when it became a geopolitical initiative under another anti-space president, Bill Clinton. Clinton had no interest in the space program, but he needed something to engage the post-Soviet Union, Russia, with money for their aerospace industry, so they didn't sell all their materials to bad players around the world. And Al Gore, as vice president, he was pro-space, said, we got the space station, let's engage the Russians on the space station. Well, the space people didn't like that. American people wanted to do it without the Russians, but Clinton immediately jumped on that. They brought the Russians into it, and that got the space station built, because that gave it the political support and the budgetary support it needed. So there's the second human space program initiative, also driven by geopolitics. and none has ever been driven since. I earlier mentioned that George Bush, both of them, tried to do something but never had any geopolitical rationale. And so I have the view that without a great geopolitical purpose that really serves the larger community, there really won't be a great human space exploration push. Now, you might look at the Artemis program and say, well, no, it's going on. It's going on with a lot of difficulty. It still doesn't have full budget support. It's still quite uncertain. So we'll see.
Would you say we're in a space race with China right now?
Yes, to some extent. The extent is that it's real. The Chinese are doing some very, very good things, including sending humans to the moon, including a Mars sample return, which we have just canceled, including asteroid mission, a whole series of lunar infrastructure missions, setting up a lunar base. So the Chinese are doing a lot of interesting things. So in a sense, we're in a space race, but the fact is America doesn't seem to care.
Yeah.
We're canceling our missions to the moon and Mars at the same time. So I'd say we've sort of elected not to be in a space race, despite the speeches of people like, well, even Trump mentioned it, but Ted Cruz mentions it. A few people mention it, but they don't do anything about it.
Well, what I find very interesting is on the rare occasion you see a piece of Chinese media discussing the space program in English, and if you just sort of accept for the moment that it's accurate, they really appear to be reading directly from the Apollo playbook down to 1 through 10, each one building on the previous one with the additional step of a far-side communication system. It is really remarkable for that to see, again, assuming what I'm reading is accurate, they're basically saying this worked, we're going to do it that way, and add things along the way. That makes sense.
Well, I think the Chinese have a view, and actually it's been expressed explicitly by their premier, Xi. Xi gave a speech in 2017, which he said the future of our country is going to be determined by our leadership in science and technology.
Yeah.
And that speech is remarkable because it wasn't the usual kind of breastbeating, we're going to be the strongest nation in the world, we're going to conquer this land or that land, and it wasn't hegemonious, it was that we're going to be leaders in science and technology, and that will make China great again. And that's very different kind of view, and I think they've been inexorably moving on that view. Now, you can argue that it's benign. Why shouldn't they be leaders in science and technology? That's a worthy goal. And they're just part of their national aspiration. Or you can argue, as China hawks in our country will, that it's not benign at all, it's hostile. It's about beating America. It's about being able to have dominance over us. But I think it's independent of that. I think it's just a national aspiration.
I think it's an interesting question. Committing a nation to the understanding of objective reality, which is what science is about, is an interesting thing to be threatened by. And I'll leave it at that. I'm curious about if we could kind of tell the story of how you left the Planetary Society full time. I mean, I don't actually know when that was, but I'm curious, when did you start to feel like your time was limited there, or you were ready to move on?
Let me see if I can get my phone to stop ringing.
No worries, I can edit that out.
Yes, 2010 is when I retired. A couple of years before that is when I decided, and it was a good time. We were active, we were doing things, it was all interesting. Some of it was becoming routinely repeatedly interesting, but I certainly wanted to be active. I had two forces at hand. One is I was at that time becoming 70 years old, and I did not want to be the old guy. I wanted the society to last a long time, but I didn't want to be there as the old guy that the current people were waiting around to die.
Okay,
so I
fair.
said, that's not going to be my future.
Fair.
I wanted to get out while I was active and not being forced out because of any senility or something. The other factor was there was a change going on, and this relates to what we were talking about at the very, very beginning in advocacy. It was moving away from the techniques of the 1980s, 1990s, the citizen action approaches. It was this new thing called the Internet. Internet was they had a niche in our publication. We were active on it. But then there was this whole notion of blogs and social media being developed in the years of 2008, 9, 10, 11. That's the, coming around. They were playing a big part. And you could see that it was both influencing the outcome, but it was also, it was influencing the ends and the means.
Sure.
And I had gone through a period in the early 80s of having to learn things I never wanted to learn about. Direct mail, fundraising, asking people for money and letters, signing here, techniques of telemarketing, calling people up and saying, hi, I'm from the Planetary Society. We have this cause. Will you give $25? Get them in. I learned a lot and did a lot of new techniques of things in direct mail and fundraising and all that. I didn't want to go through all that again in a whole new medium, social media.
Well, you're better off because that's soul sucking.
I kind of said, well, this is the time. There's other people who will do that, and they may like it, or maybe won't. But that was it. And planetary exploration was being well supported at the time.
Yes.
So it wasn't like we had to leave in a situation of that kind of thing. The role of the society sort of had to be redefined in an era when there was good planetary exploration and yet new changes of way of public information and engagement.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like obviously you started the thing, but you really led it for a generation of people and technology and space missions. I mean, I think that's the conclusion I'm coming to after this discussion.
Now we have another time when the role of the society has to be redefined again. They have to become advocates in a much more adversarial situation. And it'll be interesting to me to see if they're up for it.
I agree. And I think that is the great place to stop for this discussion. Once again, I thank you for this fascinating look at all of these different forces of American life and society for the last 30, 40 years. I'm sure I'll have more questions.
Interesting times. I don't know if I sometimes hear it's the Chinese curse or the Middle Eastern curse.
Yeah, may you live in interesting times. I think we certainly do.
I hope you live in interesting times. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, down to that hearing in the Senate, or that markup session, was between our last recording and today. I mean, it really is.
Right.
Of course, it's always going on. So thank you very much again. I'm sure we'll hear from you again soon. And
enjoyable, and
thank you.
We'll be in touch. Yeah, thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening to the Space Madness podcast.